Imperium, The Philosophy of History and Politics, Part 2, Chapter 9, The Inner Aspect of the Law of Sovereignty. The law of sovereignty describes characteristics of all political units whatever. It places the decision in every matter having political significance with the organism. Depending on circumstances, any one, or even more, internal issues may become important politically, i.e., may begin to assume the form of a political unit and determine a friend-enemy disjunction. The government of the organism will always intervene at this point if its understanding and will are unimpaired. Charles I of England allowed this critical juncture to pass by allowing his first parliament to send Montague to the Tower for preaching the divine right of kings. From then on, the situation deteriorated steadily, and a correspondingly increasing amount of force was necessary to attempt to change the direction events were moving. The actual significance of the struggle was seen from the very beginning by the contemporary political thinker Thomas Hobbes, who wrote against the state-destroying nature of the parliamentary position. He was also sensitive enough to the situation to know when things had reached the stage of personal insecurity, and left England in 1640. During these years of internal enmity, England did not exist as a political unit. It was ignored in European power combinations, and it can thank the total European situation that it was not partitioned. The Parliament considered itself the government. The monarchists considered themselves the government. A political outlook naturally does not concern itself with the question of which was right. Such a question has no political meaning. It has only a legal meaning, and law is a reflex of politics. Politics is concerned with assessing facts and acting upon them. Law comes afterward and has the function of consolidating a given political fact complex. Law formulates the disjunction legal-illegal according to political dictate. If there is no political unit to prescribe the law, there can be no law. Thus, in time of civil war, there is no law. There are two laws. If the result of the war is a reconstitution of the former people and territory again as a political unit, it will always turn out that the victor was the one who was legally right all the time, and the defeated was legally wrong. This invariable fact shows the nature of law. Nevertheless, Parliament and King stood opposed, each claiming to be England. Politically, they were both wrong, for there was no England. In political language, two Englands equal no England. Each of the two groups was a political unit, and had become such by determining an enemy. Each of them was conducting itself as a government, and each availed itself of the organic political right. Also, but afterward, a legal right, to determine the inner enemy. An organic characteristic of all political units whatever, that they determine the inner enemy when they feel it necessary, is the internal corollary of the law of sovereignty. Thus, cavaliers in parliamentary territory were the enemy of the government, and their existence was that of outlaws, correspondingly with the adherents of Parliament in royal territory. It must not be supposed, because of the example used of a civil war, that such determination of the inner enemy only occurs then. On the contrary, if Charles I had declared his opponents to be inner enemies from the very beginning, and had treated them as such, there would have been no civil war. To do this, however, he lacked the vigor and the understanding. He should have consulted Hobbes, who understood these things. But Charles was not a reading man, and did not know Hobbes's treatises on human nature and de corpore politico. Every political unit in history has exercised in need, and sometimes not in need, its organic power to determine the inner enemy. If it does it soon and proceeds thoroughly, the danger is past. If it procrastinates and takes half measures, it ceases to be a political unit. If it exercises this power when there is no need, it is merely persecuting its own population, and is sowing seeds of hatred that will one day bear surprising fruit. The organic ethic of the relation of the statesman to his political unit applies also to conduct of this type. The statesman has no organic right to dispose wantonly of the lives of the populace, to send subjects to their death in a war against a power not a real enemy, a war which thus by its very nature must be unsuccessful, or to declare a group as an enemy when it does not contain the real possibility of constituting itself as a true political unit, is vicious, non-political conduct in both cases. Such a man exposes himself to the organic sanction that destiny often imposes in such cases. This organic right to determine the inner enemy is not always exercised in the same manner. It may be open, arrest, sudden attack, shooting down at home, butchery in the streets. It may be concealed, drawing up of punitive laws, general in their terms, but applying in fact only to one group. It may be purely formless, but nonetheless real. The ruler may attack verbally the individual or group in question. Such a declaration may be used only to intimidate, or it may be a method of bringing about assassination. It may be economic pressure. Such a tactic is naturally the favorite of liberals. A blacklist or boycott may destroy the group or individual. It goes without saying that the exercise of such a right has no connection whatever with any written constitution, which purports verbally to distribute the public power in a political unit. Such a constitution may forbid such a declaration of inner enemy, but units with such constitutions have never hesitated in need, and have often invoked such procedure independently of need. Thus, the transatlantic part of the anti-Europe coalition in the Second World War carried out, quite independently of necessity, since there was no real inner enemy as a matter of fact, extensive inner persecutions directed against groups and strata of its population. It does not affect the political nature of this activity that it was done by culture-distorting elements, for the organic laws set out here describe all political units whatever, even if they fall into the hands of political and cultural outsiders. Imperium Part 2, Chapter 9, Section 2. This inward application of the law of sovereignty is of course valid for political units in all high cultures. Our information on it in the classical culture is sufficient to show its development there. The best known example is that of the resolution of Demophantos in the year 410 BC, which declared of every person who sought to destroy Athenian democracy that he was an enemy of the Athenians. In the same period, the ephors of Sparta declared war on all Helots found living within the territory of Sparta. In our own culture, the activities of the Grand Inquisitor Torquemada are instructive. And above all, the famous document by which Philip II condemned the entire population of the Netherlands to death as heretics represents about the ultimate development of which this organic right is capable. Calvin's theocracy in Geneva was outdone by Philip only quantitatively. In Old Roman public law, the undesirable was declared solemnly to be hostis, which was the word describing the public enemy. The imperial proscriptions, regardless of their economic motive, were an application of the same organic function. In the Holy Roman Empire, the Achtun Ban were directed against inner dangerous or unwanted elements. They were declared friedlos and placed outside all protection. Anyone aiding such a person fell thereby into the same category. The Jacobins in the Comité de Salut Public slew their thousands of victims, both with and without declaration of enmity. In early democratic conditions, the weakening of the state vis-à-vis internal groups would have made it more difficult to invoke this right. But correspondingly, since all Western states were in more or less the same internal condition, the necessity for its invocation was not often present. In any case, the triumph of theories of equality and freedom in the realm of political vocabulary made it inexpedient to invoke the right in the old open, declared, legalistic way. The early democracy was, in the Western civilization, from about 1800 to 1850. During this period, internal sovereignty as exemplified by determination of the internal enemy was more refined, intellectualized, concealed. Examples: the American Alien and Sedition Laws, The Austrian measures against Democrats, 1815 to 1848. Bismarck's law against class warriors. Of course, in war the right was as forcefully exercised as ever, but was usually legally formless. The Yankees in the American War of Secession, 1861 to 1865. French Communards, 1871. With the sudden transition to non-democratic conditions marked by the First World War, began the Age of Wars of Annihilation. It could also be called the Age of Absolute Politics. The 19th century was the age of economics. Not that economics was ever prior in a real sense in the world of action, but economics supplied much of the motivation of politics, as shown by phenomena like the Opium War, the American War of Secession, the Boer War. Economics was a weak state, and in the age of economics, the states were on the defensive. But the new zeitgeist changed the entire meaning of history and content of action. Because of the fact that the zeitgeist of the 20th century did not attain to external triumph in all Europe, many supposed that the age of economics was not only continuing, but was attaining to new victorious heights. That this was not the case was shown by the war which greeted the opening of the century. The war in question was between the Boer state, a colony of the Western civilization, and England. The war was not against savages or aborigines of spoiled lands, and thus does not come into the same classification as the Australian War against the autochthonous tribes of Tasmania, when the victims were hunted down like rabbits to total extermination. We have seen that the armed contests between Western culture states were not true wars, but were agonal in nature. The turning point to civilization was marked by Napoleon, the herald of absolute war and politics. But this tradition continued so strong that in the French War against Prussia, 1870 to 1871, victorious Prussia still did not think of annihilating the totally defeated foe, nor of subjecting it to an endless military occupation, but contented itself with reincorporating 2 provinces and imposing an indemnity which was paid off in a few years. England had also so conducted itself in intracultural armed contests, and yet in 1900 it carried the war against the Boer to complete annihilation. This was in true 20th century style. And note that it was England, the organism which had brought forth the idea of the 19th century, and was not destined to produce the idea of the 20th century, which thus acted completely within the spirit of the new age. So strong is the spirit of the age, it compels inner submission even though one use the formula of the past and believe that he is leading a moribund idea to new life. The Boer War was mentioned because it marked a turning point also in the matter of the internal aspect of the law of sovereignty. In this war, the English armies initiated the 20th century method of designating and handling the inner enemy. It is nonetheless an historical epoch in this matter that no real political need existed for what occurred, for we are interested in what did occur, and not in rewriting history. In this war, large numbers of civilian Boers, men, women, and children, came into the custody of the English armies. They were taken into custody on the theory that they were a danger to the internal security of the territory controlled by the empire, that thus they were inner enemies. The numbers involved were considerable, too great for the systems of prisons and jails there existing. The solution adopted was to place them into detention camps, hastily constructed ad hoc. These were called concentration camps, and this word was to have a destiny of its own. After the First World War, the age of absolute politics showed its manifestations everywhere, and one way it did was to introduce this concentration camp system into every country in the Western civilization. The more dangerous its external situation, the greater was the necessity of firm inner control, unbroken and unbreakable inner peace. And thus those countries with the most political concern introduced large numbers of persons they declared inner enemies, or in any case, treated as inner enemies, into prison camps. But since the word was connected with politics, it acquired polemical significance, and was used by some states as a method of attacking the morality of other states. And yet these concentration camps were similar in all countries, just as prisons are. It is not material that extra-European forces imprisoned Europeans in the camps they set up in England, or that Europe imprisoned Slavs, Jews, and Bolsheviks in the camps it set up in Europe. The camps were essentially the same from the political standpoint. They both illustrate the internal aspect of the law of sovereignty as it develops in the 20th century. The age of absolute politics has a full century more in its course, and thus the number of prison camps and the number of inmates will increase and not decrease. It remains to say a word on the future development of internal sovereignty. Since the spirit of these times and the next is no longer that of economics, but that of absolute politics, sly and veiled methods of acting against inner individuals and groups will fall into disuse. In their place will appear once more open and legally formulated inner enemy declarations. Even economically motivated determinations will be quite openly pursued with political means.